By 1967, America had been at war in Vietnam so long that people had stopped asking why and started asking how long. Presidents came and went. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, each one inheriting a problem wrapped in the flag and sold as destiny. They all repeated the same polished line, that losing Vietnam would be the first domino in a chain leading to global communism. And every time that line got shaky, someone in Washington threw another generation of soldiers on the pile to hold it up. Behind the speeches and televised optimism was a quiet panic. Deep inside the Pentagon, a handful of insiders knew the war was already a corpse. They were just arguing over how to pose it for the cameras. The American public heard about progress. The insiders talked about containment of failure. Into that fog stepped Daniel Ellsberg, a man so straight-laced that even the Marines thought he was intense. Harvard PhD, Rand Corporation analyst, ex-infantry officer, he believed numbers could fix anything, even war. Rand was a think tank that lived off the Pentagon's nightmares. Their job was to quantify everything from missile deterrence to body counts. If the government could put a price tag on victory, Rand would print the receipt. Ellsberg spent his early career helping design war plans for nuclear Armageddon. When you've run the math on ending the world, Southeast Asia doesn't look so complicated. So when the Defense Department asked Rand to help evaluate the situation in Vietnam, Ellsberg was the perfect candidate. Patriotic, credentialed, and naive enough to think honesty mattered. Then he read the memos. He read in 1954, before most Americans could find Vietnam on a map, the U.S. had quietly funded the French war effort there, while denying it publicly. He read that by 1961, Kennedy's advisors already knew Diem's regime was corrupt and doomed, but doubled down anyway because losing was politically unacceptable. He read that Johnson's Gulf of Tonkin speech, the one that turned a regional conflict into a full-scale war, was built on incidents that never happened the way the White House claimed. Each revelation was a new level of betrayal. Presidents weren't just lying to voters, they were lying to Congress, to allies, and even to each other. The United States had been fighting not for democracy, but for deniability. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered an internal study, a top-secret history of America's involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The official reason was academic reflection. The real reason was guilt. McNamara already knew the war was lost. He just wanted a record of how it had all gone wrong. Maybe so future historians would understand that it hadn't been his idea alone. The report, compiled by dozens of analysts, ran over 7,000 pages across 47 volumes. Each page was stamped top secret, not because it contained operational plans, but because it contained embarrassment. Ellsberg, by then back at Rand with a necessary clearance, was among the first civilians to read it. He'd entered the project expecting complexity. What he found was duplicity layered like geological strata. There were cables where presidents promised peace while ordering bombings, memoranda describing fake casualty reports, and strategy papers admitting, years before the Tet Offensive, that the war could not be won short of genocide. He later said that reading those documents felt like discovering that the family Bible was a forgery. Every patriotic speech he'd ever believed suddenly sounded like a con. In 1968, while politicians in Washington debated how to define peace with honor, Ellsberg was losing faith in the very idea of honorable war. He'd spent time in Vietnam in '65 and '66, trudging through jungle mud beside soldiers who thought they were saving a country that didn't want saving. He'd seen intelligence reports rewritten to fit what commanders wanted to believe. He'd watched operations launched for no reason other than to keep the weekly statistics moving upward. When he asked a colonel why they kept taking the same hill, the man said, "Because it's on the chart." Back home, Ellsberg began to see the system for what it was, a lie factory powered by good intentions and bad incentives. He was still patriotic, but now in the dangerous way. The kind where loyalty to truth outweighs loyalty to orders. In 1969, he met fellow Rand analyst Anthony Russo, an idealist with access to a Xerox machine the size of a refrigerator. Together they began copying the entire Pentagon study, one page at a time, late at night. The copier jammed constantly, the motor whined like an alarm, and every clunk sounded like a prison door. Each page they duplicated was a felony under the Espionage Act. Ellsberg described the fear as physical. Sweat dripped onto the pages. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it through the floor. But he kept going, night after night, until 47 binders sat in his apartment, an archive of official deceit weighing more than his conscience could carry alone. He tried the proper channels first. He gave portions to senators, including William Fulbright and George McGovern, who sympathized but hesitated. They feared political suicide. America was still deeply divided over the war, and leaking classified material was a fast way to end up in handcuffs, or worse. When Congress refused, Ellsberg turned to the press. He knew that once the story broke, he'd never have a normal life again. He'd lose his job, his clearance, his reputation. He might lose his freedom. But after years of watching politicians trade lives for headlines, he'd stopped caring about the cost. History remembers the moment the leak hit print. But the real revolution happened in that empty Rand copy room, where a single man decided that the truth wasn't property of the government. It belonged to everyone who'd been asked to die for it. When Daniel Ellsberg came home from Vietnam in 1967, he was still a believer, but the cracks were spreading. He'd gone to the jungle expecting chaos and found something worse: order, the bureaucratic kind that measures success by how neatly it can lie to itself. Ellsberg had served as a Marine officer in the 1950s, a true Cold War patriot who saw the fight against communism as the moral spine of American policy. He admired discipline, hierarchy, the chain of command. But Vietnam changed all that. He watched platoons grind through villages for statistics, kill ratios that existed mainly to decorate PowerPoints that hadn't been invented yet. He once asked a commander why the report said an operation was successful when the objective was never achieved. The officer shrugged. "Because it has to be," he said. The paperwork required victory, so victory appeared on paper. Reality was a rounding error. Ellsberg realized the war machine wasn't running on facts or strategy. It was running on momentum, the kind that keeps a train rolling long after the engineer knows there's no track ahead. Each administration just added another car to the wreck. When he returned to Rand, the analysts greeted him like a field biologist who'd survived the jungle. He looked the same, trim, polite, in his mid-30s, but something had shifted behind his eyes. He stopped smiling at the word policy. At a dinner party in late 1968, someone asked him whether the U.S. could still win. He said quietly, "Win what?" The table went silent. That was the moment he stopped being a technocrat and started becoming dangerous. That same year, the Tet Offensive ripped through the myth of progress. American commanders had promised the enemy was on its last legs. Instead, the Viet Cong launched attacks in over 100 cities simultaneously. Walter Cronkite called the war mired in stalemate. Lyndon Johnson muttered, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He was right. Within weeks, Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election. But Ellsberg's conversion wasn't just political, it was moral. He began reading the philosophers he'd once skimmed past: Gandhi, Thoreau, the Stoics. He found himself haunted by a question: what do you owe your country when your country is wrong? He started attending anti-war rallies in disguise, the kind of thing that could get a defense contractor blacklisted. He listened to students chant against the system he still technically worked for. At one rally, a young man handed him a pamphlet titled "Why We Resist." Ellsberg kept it folded in his wallet for years. At Rand, his colleagues noticed the change. He began arguing openly with superiors, challenging assumptions, calling for a negotiated withdrawal. One senior analyst told him, "You sound like you work for the other side." Ellsberg replied, "I do, the human side." The more he spoke out, the more he realized that dissent wasn't permitted. It was pathologized. The establishment treated moral outrage like a mental illness, which, for a man trained in logic, was infuriating. Then came the breaking point. In 1969, Ellsberg attended a war conference in Washington where a Defense Department official described civilian casualties as collateral input. The phrase landed like shrapnel. The audience nodded. Ellsberg didn't. He realized the government wasn't indifferent to suffering. It was anesthetized to it. He returned to California with a decision forming in his mind. If the system couldn't reform itself, someone outside had to light the match. He reconnected with Anthony Russo, the RAND colleague who'd once studied counterinsurgency psychology. Russo had gone further left, protesting openly, and kept talking about moral courage. Ellsberg used to roll his eyes. Now he was asking how much courage a Xerox machine could handle before it caught fire. Late one night, Russo handed him a fresh box of paper. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. Ellsberg nodded. "They're killing people based on lies. If that's treason, then I'm guilty." Over the next several months, Ellsberg lived a double life. By day, a respected consultant. By night, an outlaw historian. He and Russo copied page after page of the Pentagon Papers, sometimes with Ellsberg's young children helping to collate stacks. He told them they were helping Daddy make history. They didn't realize he meant it literally. The process was mechanical, hypnotic, and terrifying. Every whir of the copier sounded like a countdown. He later said the fear wasn't of prison, but of irrelevance, of knowing the truth and doing nothing. By 1970, Ellsberg had the entire 7,000-page report duplicated and stored in multiple secret locations. But now came the hard part, getting someone to care. He tried quiet diplomacy first. Senator J. William Fulbright declined, fearing political fallout. Senator George McGovern listened sympathetically, but stopped short of acting. Even Senator Charles Mathias, one of the few Republicans skeptical of the war, told him flatly, "No one will thank you for this." Ellsberg was losing patience. The war was expanding into Cambodia, and the casualty list kept growing. He began thinking less like an analyst and more like a saboteur. He approached Neil Sheehan at the New York Times, a journalist who'd covered Vietnam and shared his disgust. Sheehan agreed to read the documents, but asked, "Do you understand what this means for you?" Ellsberg did. He'd crossed the Rubicon. The next step would destroy his career and possibly land him in federal prison. But compared to the body count, that felt like a manageable loss. He later described the choice in simple terms. When you've seen a government kill for a lie, silence becomes complicity. That's when Daniel Ellsberg, the Marine, the scholar, the insider, died, and the whistleblower was born. Not because he wanted revenge or glory or a movie deal decades later, but because somewhere between Saigon and Washington, he rediscovered the thing every bureaucracy fears most, a conscience. By the spring of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg had become a man waiting for the knock at the door. 7,000 pages of classified history sat boxed in his Cambridge apartment like a homemade bomb that hadn't gone off yet. He offered them to senators, priests, professors, anyone with a public conscience, and each time the answer was the same: too risky. So he turned to the one institution that still scared politicians, the press. He met New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan in a Boston hotel room and slid a cardboard box across the bed. "Read this," he said. Sheehan did. 3 days later, he called his editor and said, "We've got the story of the century." The Times had been burned before. Leaks could be junk, exaggeration, or political traps. But as editors skimmed the documents, their faces drained of color. Each memo, each cable, each policy summary contradicted the public record. Presidents had lied to Congress, to allies, and to their own soldiers. The study showed a continuous thread of deception stretching from Truman to Johnson, a bipartisan masterpiece of denial. Managing editor Abe Rosenthal locked the papers in a secure room on the 10th floor and built a small team of reporters around Sheehan. They worked in secret for 3 months, codenaming the Project X. Guards checked ID badges at the door. Reporters slept on office couches. They printed copies on unmarked machines so janitors wouldn't see top secret headers rolling out of the trays. On June 13, 1971, the Times ran the first headline: Vietnam Archive, Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement. The story opened with the calm precision of a scalpel. The United States government has consistently misled the public about the scope and purpose of the war. It wasn't an op-ed or a leak of a single memo. It was an autopsy report on 25 years of foreign policy. By noon, every newsroom in Washington was in panic mode. Phones rang off the hook. Teletype machines jammed. Senators demanded briefings they weren't cleared to see. And somewhere inside the White House, Richard Nixon was shouting at his television. Here's the ironic part. The Pentagon Papers mostly covered decisions made before Nixon ever took office. If he'd ignored the story, it would have humiliated his predecessors and maybe even strengthened his own image as a reformer. But Nixon didn't see information. He saw conspiracy. His reflex was control. He told Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, "We can't let this happen. It will destroy our ability to govern." The Justice Department raced to court, claiming national security was at stake. They argued the leak endangered lives, military operations, and peace talks. It didn't. The war material in the papers ended 4 years earlier. What it endangered was credibility. Federal Judge Murray Gurfein, a World War II veteran, issued a temporary injunction halting publication, the first successful use of prior restraint against a major American newspaper. For the Times, it was unthinkable. The First Amendment had always been their armor. Now it was being used as evidence against them. But you can't stop a story that good. Within 48 hours, the Washington Post obtained a copy from Ellsberg's friends. Then the Boston Globe, then the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Nixon's lawyers ran themselves ragged, filing injunctions faster than newspapers could set type. Every city editor in America suddenly had the same thought. If we print, we're patriots. If we don't, we're cowards. While lawyers sparred in court, Ellsberg vanished. He moved between friends' apartments under assumed names, shaving his beard, switching cars. FBI agents watched his family's house and tapped phones. He was declared armed with classified material and potentially unstable, which in bureaucratic English means shoot if convenient. Inside the White House, Nixon's aides grew desperate. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America. Nixon ordered the creation of a small covert team to dig up dirt, the plumbers. Their job was to find anything that could discredit Ellsberg before public opinion turned him into a martyr. Meanwhile, in the Supreme Court docket, the case of United States versus New York Times was fast-tracked. Several libertarians called it the most important press freedom question since the founding of the Republic. Reporters simply called it Judgment Day. When the Times temporarily halted publication, readers protested outside their building. A handmade sign read, "If this is freedom, we're losing." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. America was fighting for democracy abroad while gagging it at home. Nixon ranted to Attorney General John Mitchell, "Don't tell me about the Constitution. This is treason." Mitchell replied, "Then we better hope the court agrees." But history wasn't on their side. On June 30, 1971, in a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court lifted the injunction. Justice Hugo Black wrote the line that would outlive them all. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Newspapers across the country republished the opinion in full, treating it like scripture. Ellsberg surfaced the next day at the federal courthouse in Boston, calmly surrendering himself to authorities. Reporters shouted questions. He said, "Wouldn't you go to prison to help end this war?" The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, the whistleblower had become the hero. The government had spent weeks insisting the leak endangered national security. What it really endangered was the idea that presidents could lie without consequence. Nixon's administration had won a few temporary injunctions, but lost something far greater: control of the narrative. As one Times editor put it afterward, "They built a wall, we found the cracks." The White House didn't call it panic, but that's exactly what it was. When the New York Times won its case, Richard Nixon wasn't worried about the secrets that had already spilled. He was worried about the ones still hidden. If the Pentagon Papers could reach daylight, what stopped tomorrow's leak from exposing his own back-channel schemes, the secret bombings of Cambodia, or the illegal wiretaps already running under his name. The administration needed a court, not a lawyer. Enter the Plumbers, a misfit crew whose resume looked like a classified personnel file and a police blotter stapled together. Former CIA operative E. Howard Hunt and ex-FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy were hired under the official title Special Investigations Unit, which sounded dull until you remember their job description was stop leaks by any means necessary. They set up shop in the basement of the executive office building, operating out of a converted dental office that still smelled faintly of Novocaine. From there, they would make history by botching it. Their first target, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding in Beverly Hills. Someone in the administration had heard Ellsberg was seeing a therapist. If the Plumbers could find notes suggesting emotional instability, they could paint him as a lunatic instead of a truth teller. In September 1971, Hunt and Liddy flew west with burglary gear, wigs, and a folder marked Ellsberg, personal. They broke into Fielding's office by night, rifled through cabinets, and left a trail of wreckage so obvious that Fielding thought local junkies had hit the place. They found nothing useful, no confession, no breakdown, not even a diary entry juicy enough for gossip columnists. But the failed break-in would later become the rotten seed that grew into Watergate. Inside the Oval Office, Nixon kept demanding harsher measures. He ordered FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to find out who'd leaked the papers. But Hoover, ever the survivor, refused to touch it. So Nixon built his own shadow security system. The Plumbers would do what the Bureau wouldn't, unbound by law or common sense. They drew up lists of enemies, a phrase that now sounds theatrical, but was typed on official stationery. Journalists, activists, senators, anyone who'd crossed the president's mood went on it. While the Plumbers prowled, Ellsberg faced his reckoning. On June 28, 1971, he was indicted under the Espionage Act for theft and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information. Maximum penalty, 115 years. The government wanted a show trial, a warning to anyone else thinking of telling the truth. Prosecutors painted Ellsberg as an egomaniac chasing fame. He sat calmly through it all, sometimes taking notes, sometimes smiling at the absurdity. The defense, led by Leonard Bowden and Charles Nesson, argued that Ellsberg's motive wasn't espionage, but conscience. He hadn't sold secrets to the Soviets. He'd handed evidence of deceit to the American people. The trial opened in January 1973 in Los Angeles federal court. Outside, anti-war protesters waved signs reading, "Free Ellsberg, jail the liars." Inside, the government star witnesses struggled to explain how telling the truth had damaged national security. One Pentagon official admitted under cross-examination that the papers contained no current operational data. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Then came the twist. During the pretrial hearings, Ellsberg's lawyers learned that the White House had wiretapped him without a warrant. A week later, another bombshell. The burglary at his psychiatrist's office had been ordered by the same men now linked to a break-in at Democratic headquarters in the Watergate complex. Suddenly, the Ellsberg case wasn't about secrecy. It was about abuse of power. Judge William Matthew Byrne, Jr., a Nixon appointee, began to realize the prosecution itself had been contaminated. When he discovered the government had destroyed key evidence and offered him the FBI directorship mid-trial, an attempted bribe essentially, he'd had enough. On May 11, 1973, Byrne dismissed all charges with prejudice, meaning the government could never refile them. Ellsberg walked out free. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. He didn't gloat. He said the crimes committed against me should be considered against every citizen's freedom. It was understated, but the implication was lethal. The President of the United States had broken the law, trying to silence the truth. For Nixon, it was a personal humiliation. He'd spent 2 years treating Ellsberg as public enemy number one, only to hand him a moral victory. Worse, the same team that had tried to destroy Ellsberg would soon be caught red-handed inside the Watergate offices, igniting the scandal that consumed the presidency. Ellsberg became a symbol of conscience, though not everyone saw him as a hero. To the establishment, he was a dangerous precedent, The idea that individuals could override classification in the name of morality was terrifying. To the anti-war movement, he was proof that courage still existed inside the machine. And to Nixon, he was unfinished business. The president fumed privately, calling him that bastard who got away. In truth, Ellsberg had done something Nixon never could. He'd beaten the system without becoming it. The plumbers would never again fix a leak. They'd drown in their own. Their failed burglary was entered into evidence during Watergate hearings, a footnote that became prophecy. What began as a mission to silence a whistleblower ended up toppling a presidency. The irony was so rich that historians still quote it with a grin. Nixon could have ignored the Pentagon Papers and survived, but he couldn't ignore his own paranoia. By mid-1973, the machinery of secrecy was crumbling. The press was emboldened, Congress was angry, and the courts had rediscovered a spine. The Pentagon Papers hadn't just exposed a war, they'd exposed how power lies, panics, and self-destructs when confronted with the truth. For 2 weeks in June 1971, the United States looked like a country trying to remember what freedom of the press actually meant. Federal judges were issuing emergency orders faster than printers could run the morning edition. The government argued that the New York Times and Washington Post were committing irreparable harm to national security. What they were really harming was the administration's ability to control embarrassment. Attorney General John Mitchell insisted that publication of the Pentagon Papers might prolong the war. Reporters quietly noted that bombing Cambodia might do the same. But now the question wasn't Vietnam, it was whether the government could pre-approve the truth. The Times and the Post were suddenly comrades in arms. Their legal teams joined forces under constitutional lawyer Alexander Bickel, who knew the First Amendment like a priest knows his rosary. Bickel's argument was simple. The founders didn't carve freedom of the press into the Constitution so presidents could erase it the moment they looked bad. On the other side, government lawyers stood in court waving the words "top secret" like a holy relic. They admitted they hadn't actually read most of the documents, because that would require clearance, but assured the judges they were dangerous anyway. One justice later said the argument felt like being asked to burn a book without being told its title. District courts in New York and Washington issued opposite rulings within hours of each other. The Times was gagged, the Post was cleared. It was a legal stalemate with the Constitution caught in the crossfire, so the Supreme Court fast-tracked the case. Less than 2 weeks after the first article appeared, United States versus New York Times Company and United States versus Washington Post Company were consolidated for an emergency hearing. June 26, 1971, the courtroom looked like a national press conference for democracy. Every seat filled, reporters jammed the aisles. The Solicitor General opened by warning that publication could cause grave and immediate danger to national security. Justice Potter Stewart leaned forward and asked, "Can you specify the danger?" The lawyer hesitated, not without revealing classified information. Stewart smiled thinly. "Then we must take it on faith?" Faith wasn't the Constitution's strongest suit. Bickel rose for the newspapers. His voice was steady, almost polite, but each sentence was a small explosion. The press exists precisely to reveal what government prefers to conceal. That people cannot delegate sovereignty to the state and then be forbidden to know how it is exercised. Justice Hugo Black, 75 years old and half deaf, scribbled a note to Justice William O. Douglas beside him. "Publish and be damned." Douglas nodded. Behind closed doors, the justices argued for days. The conservatives feared chaos. The liberals feared precedent. Justice Byron White worried that too broad a ruling might invite future leaks. Douglas countered that too narrow a ruling would invite dictatorship. In the end, 6 voted for publication, 3 against. The opinions dropped like a gavel through the Oval Office. Any system of prior restraints of expression bears a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. And then the line that every journalism student would memorize forever. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Justice Black's concurrence read less like legal prose and more like a sermon. He reminded the nation that the founders had lived under a king who punished printers for telling the truth. America's answer to tyranny wasn't secrecy, it was sunlight. When the ruling hit the wires on June 30th, newspaper presses thundered to life across the country. The Times resumed publication within minutes. The Post followed. Small papers in Kansas, Iowa, and Oregon printed summaries just to make a point. The First Amendment was no longer an abstract principle. It was ink on paper, rolling off the presses in thousands. In the White House, Nixon paced like a man who just lost a war no one else knew was being fought. "The court is against us," he told Haldeman. "The whole damn system is against us." Haldeman didn't disagree. The administration's defeat didn't just vindicate the newspapers, it changed how Americans thought about truth. Before the Pentagon Papers, many assumed that secrecy equaled safety. Afterwards, secrecy looked a lot like fear. The ruling also emboldened reporters. When the Post's Ben Bradley later confronted Nixon's team over the Watergate break-ins, he'd quote Hugo Black's line as a personal mantra. In that sense, the Pentagon Papers' decision didn't just protect the press, it armed it. Ellsberg, hiding in Boston when the verdict came down, heard the news over the radio. He felt relief first, then inevitability. "I knew they'd call it freedom," he said later, "but they'd never forgive it." He was right. The government still wanted his head, but now it had to take it in daylight. The Pentagon Papers case became a constitutional checkpoint, a reminder that the First Amendment isn't self-enforcing. It survives only when the people test it. The press had tested it and won, barely. Every future whistleblower, journalist, and editor who would trace their courage back to that 6-3 ruling. When the last issue rolled off the Times presses that night, an editor scribbled in the margin of his proof, "Publish and be damned." It wasn't defiance anymore, it was gratitude. The Pentagon Papers didn't end the Vietnam War, but they did something Washington had feared for decades. They ended the automatic assumption that the government told the truth. For the first time since World War II, Americans stopped giving presidents the benefit of the doubt. At first, the outrage was measured. Nixon publicly claimed he wasn't worried. Privately, he was throwing ashtrays. The problem wasn't what the papers revealed about past presidents. It was what they implied about the present one. If Ellsberg could get his hands on Johnson's secrets, someone else could get Nixon's, and Nixon had a lot of them. The League landed amid chaos. The U.S. was secretly bombing Cambodia under the code name Operation Menu, and the administration had flat out lied to Congress about it. The Air Force logs were falsified so that the strikes looked like they'd happened in South Vietnam. The president's men had become professional liars with flight plans. Ellsberg's example terrified them because it proved that even the best-kept secrets could walk out the door in a briefcase. So Nixon built walls, literal, legal, psychological. He ordered the FBI to wiretap journalists, instructed the CIA to spy domestically, a direct violation of its charter, and created a culture where paranoia counted as patriotism. Inside the Oval Office, conversations were taped automatically. Nixon's idea of record keeping. Those tapes would eventually record his downfall. He also approved the creation of that Special Investigations Unit, the Plumbers, whose first target had been Ellsberg's psychiatrist. When they failed to destroy Ellsberg, they went looking for softer targets. By 1972, the Plumbers were moonlighting as political saboteurs for the Committee to Re-elect the President, better known by the word's most unfortunate acronym, CREEP. Their assignment in June 1972 was simple and stupid. Break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex and bug the phones. They got caught. The burglars included two of the same men who had once tried to smear Ellsberg. One of them, when arrested, carried the phone number of E. Howard Hunt, the same Hunt who'd led the break-in at Dr. Fielding's office. In the space of 9 months, Nixon's crusade against leaks had mutated into the greatest political scandal in American history. At first, the White House called the Watergate arrests a third-rate burglary. But the FBI traced the money found on the burglars to a slush fund run by CREEP. The thread led straight to the Oval Office. The same mindset that had treated Ellsberg as an existential threat now treated democracy the same way, a security risk. Meanwhile, public trust collapsed faster than the Mekong Delta in monsoon season. Polls showed that fewer than 30% of Americans believed what the government said about Vietnam. Protests swelled, draft resistance intensified. Even veterans returning from the war started questioning why they'd been sent in the first place. Ellsberg's leak hadn't caused that doubt, it had given it evidence. When the Watergate hearings began in 1973, senators began circling back to the same question. Why did the president have an enemies list? The answer led through the plumbers, through the burglary at Ellsberg's psychiatrist, straight into the heart of the Pentagon Papers paranoia. Every abuse of power could be traced back to the moment Nixon decided that truth itself was subversive. In one of the hearings, counsel Sam Ervin read from a memo describing the Fielding break-in. This, gentlemen, he said, was a burglary committed in the name of national security. The chamber went silent. The dots had officially been connected. While Washington unraveled, Ellsberg was free, teaching and giving interviews. He never gloated. He didn't need to. History was doing it for him. When asked about Watergate, he said, "The Pentagon Papers didn't end the war, but they ended the illusion that presidents can be trusted to wage one in secret." It was a polite way of saying, "I warned you." As investigators subpoenaed Nixon's tapes, they discovered the president himself ordering the CIA to block the FBI's probe into Watergate, a textbook obstruction of justice. The same instinct that tried to bury Ellsberg now tried to bury the Constitution. By August 1974, Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment. When he left the White House lawn aboard Marine One, the rotors drowned out the sound of the Republic exhaling. The war in Vietnam would drag on another year, but the moral war was already over. In the years that followed, Congress tried to put guardrails back on executive power. The War Powers Act of 1973, limiting a president's ability to deploy troops without approval. The Freedom of Information Act amendments, prying open the government's filing cabinets. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, designed to stop exactly the kind of warrantless spying Nixon had made routine. Each reform was a scar left by the same wound. For the press, the lesson was carved in stone. Never trust an administration's definition of national security. For whistleblowers, Ellsberg became both warning and inspiration. He'd escaped prison mostly because the government's own misconduct poisoned its case. Others might not be so lucky, but they would still follow his path. From the Deep Throat during Watergate, to Chelsea Manning, to Edward Snowden decades later. Each of them, in one way or another, was an echo of that first man feeding classified truth through a copier at 2 a.m. For the American public, the Pentagon Papers and Watergate formed a 1-2 punch to the national ego. The myth of righteous leadership died not with a bang, but with a subpoena. The same government that told citizens to die for democracy had been bugging its own headquarters. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize the period as the golden age of accountability. It wasn't. It was a nervous breakdown with good journalism. But from that wreckage, modern transparency laws, investigative reporting, and the very concept of the whistleblower emerged fully formed. The Pentagon Papers didn't topple Nixon directly, but they lit the fuse that did. They taught every president after him that lies have a half-life, and once exposed, they decay everything around them. They also taught every citizen a grim civics lesson, that the truth isn't given, it's stolen back, one photocopy at a time. In the half-century since the Pentagon Papers hit the presses, the story has been absorbed into the bloodstream of American history. Everyone knows the outline. One man leaks classified files, the government panics, the courts uphold the press. What most forget is how much it changed everything underneath. Before 1971, the relationship between the public and the presidency was like a marriage built on trust and television. People might complain about policy, but they still believed the commander-in-chief was basically honest. After the papers, that faith was gone. Pollsters even invented a new phrase for it, the credibility gap, because national disillusionment didn't fit on a chart. The myth of benevolent secrecy died with Ellsberg's Xerox machine. Until then, classified sounded noble, like a vault protecting national safety. Afterward, it started to sound like a cover-up. Journalists learned to smell fear behind every no comment. Congress rediscovered its oversight muscles. The public learned that patriotism and obedience aren't synonyms. Inside the Beltway, officials quietly rewrote the rules. The classification system exploded in size. Ironically, the lesson they took from the leak was seal the vault tighter. But tightening secrecy only fed suspicion. By the mid-1970s, the Church Committee was exposing decades of CIA and FBI abuses, assassination plots, domestic spying, mail-opening programs, all hidden behind the same words that once protected the Vietnam deception: national security. Ellsberg himself became an odd kind of folk hero. He never looked the part, more professor than rebel, but he spent the rest of his life campaigning for transparency, nuclear disarmament, and whistleblower protections. He was arrested dozens of times at protests, but never silenced. When reporters asked if he'd regretted anything, he said, "Only that I didn't do it sooner." The cultural echo was enormous. Hollywood turned the idea of a whistleblower into a modern archetype, the lone insider standing against the system. Movies like All the President's Men and later The Post traced their DNA directly to the Pentagon Papers. In classrooms, civics teachers used Ellsberg's story to explain why the First Amendment isn't just ink on parchment. It's the only reason citizens know their leaders are lying. But the government also adapted. The modern security state learned to play the long game, drown the truth in classification, leak selectively, and label dissenters as threats. When Chelsea Manning released documents on Iraq and Afghanistan, officials invoked the same rhetoric Nixon had: grave danger to national security. When Edward Snowden exposed global surveillance, the Justice Department charged him under the same Espionage Act used against Ellsberg. The machinery hadn't changed, it had just updated its software. Ellsberg defended them all. He said he saw different decades, same disease. He argued that secrecy was addictive, that once a government starts lying for security, it can't stop. Every classified file, he said, contains two secrets: what it says and why you weren't supposed to know it. His insight cut deeper than politics. The Pentagon Papers weren't just about Vietnam. They were about the psychology of power. Bureaucracies lie not because they enjoy it, but because truth is unpredictable. Lies can be managed, memoed, and briefed. Truth has a habit of wandering off script. That's why Ellsberg Act still matters. It wasn't a protest against a single war. It was a reminder that democracy dies of convenience long before it dies of conspiracy. The temptation to hide bad news is as old as government itself. The danger is when the habit becomes policy. In that sense, the Pentagon Papers marked the moment America grew up. The country lost its innocence, its blind faith, and maybe a bit of its pride, but it gained something better: the ability to question authority without apology. The cynicism that followed wasn't a flaw, it was self-defense. Decades later, declassified memos revealed that even some of Nixon's aides privately admired Ellsberg's nerve. They didn't say it aloud, of course, but one note scrawled in the margin of an internal memo read, "He had the guts we pretended to have." That might be the most honest assessment ever written in Washington. When Ellsberg died in 2023 at the age of 92, obituaries couldn't decide what to call him: traitor, hero, patriot, spy. The contradictions fit. America had always revered rebels once they're safely dead. By then, even the Pentagon kept a copy of the papers in its archives. The same documents once branded subversive, now studied as history. Time has a dark sense of humor. The larger legacy of the Pentagon Papers is that truth became a moving target instead of a possession. Presidents now assume every secret will eventually leak. Every memo will someday appear on a screen. That awareness hasn't made them more honest, but made them more cautious. And that, in the grim arithmetic of democracy, counts as progress. Ellsberg once said that governments fear two things: leaks and laughter. Leaks show their weakness, laughter show their absurdity. The Pentagon Papers delivered both. They exposed the absurd idea that democracy could wage war indefinitely while lying to itself about why. 50 years on, the sound of that old Xerox machine still echoes through American politics. Every time a whistleblower steps forward, every time a reporter prints a story marked classified, that hum is still there in the background. the rhythm of one man deciding that the truth wasn't property of the state. Half a century later, the Pentagon Papers feel less like a story from another era and more like the prologue to the one we're living in. The details have aged, the typewriters, the rotary phones, the hum of that monstrous Xerox, but the argument hasn't changed at all. Who decides what the public is allowed to know? And what happens when that decision is wrong? The United States never stopped producing secret reports. It just switched from binders to servers. The same government that once stamped top secret across paper now hides it behind firewalls and need-to-know clearance screens. But secrecy still leaks because people still have consciences, and thumb drives are faster than copy machines. Ellsberg's act drew a line that everyone since has walked. When Chelsea Manning copied battlefield logs onto a CD labeled Lady Gaga, when Edward Snowden siphoned surveillance files from the NSA, when journalists from The Intercept or The Guardian published classified evidence of wrongdoing, they were all playing variations of the same tune. The technology changed, but the melody stayed the same. Truth versus control, a duet the government never learned to harmonize. The phrase Pentagon Papers moment has become journalistic shorthand for the instant a secret crosses over into history. Editors still argue in glass conference rooms about whether to hit publish, and somewhere in the debate someone always mutters, "Remember Ellsberg." He's the ghost in every newsroom printer, whispering that democracy isn't tidy. Politicians, of course, learned their own lesson. They stopped pretending leaks could be prevented and started managing them. Today's anonymous sources close to the White House are often official leaks, trial balloons released to test the wind. Real whistleblowers, the dangerous kind, still face prison. The Espionage Act of 1917, written for German saboteurs, remains the government's favorite cudgel against citizens who embarrass it. Ellsberg called that the longest-running typo in American law. The deeper legacy of the Pentagon Papers isn't legal, it's cultural. It taught citizens that skepticism is not disloyalty, that patriotism sometimes looks like insubordination, and that faith in government should be earned, not presumed. The cynicism that followed was ugly at times, but it also kept the Republic honest, or at least slightly less dishonest. Every generation since had wrestled with the same dilemma: how to balance secrecy and accountability in a world that runs on both. After 9/11, the pendulum swung hard towards secrecy again. New wars were launched, surveillance expanded, and entire programs were hidden under the banner of national security. It felt like deja vu with better graphics. When the next leak came, Guantanamo files, drone strike data, State Department cables, the arguments were copy and pasted from 1971. The machinery of secrecy never retires, it just gets new stationery. For historians, the Pentagon Papers mark the dividing line between two Americas, the one that trusted authority and the one that demanded proof. For journalists, it remains the gold standard of why the First Amendment exists. And for ordinary citizens, it's a reminder that truth is never free. It's rented, and the rent is courage. When Ellsberg looked back near the end of his life, he said something few noticed. It wasn't the documents that changed history, it was the act of copying them. He meant that the real revolution wasn't information, it was disobedience. He had violated the unwritten rule that power gets to decide when it's accountable. Once that taboo broke, it never fully healed. There's a quiet irony in how it ended. The same Pentagon that once called him a criminal now invites graduate students to study the papers in its archives. The files that once endangered national security now sit on public shelves under fluorescent lights, gathering dust instead of headlines. Time has a sense of humor sharper than any journalist. Ellsberg lived long enough to watch whistleblowing evolve from treason to trend. When he saw younger leakers facing the same charges he once did, he offered them advice that sounded half philosophy, half Marine Corps. Courage is contagious, but so is fear. Be careful which one you spread. Maybe that's the real moral of the Pentagon Papers. The truth doesn't win because it's loud. It wins because it refuses to shut up. One copier, one conscience, and a country built on free speech were enough to shake the world's most powerful government. Not bad for a man armed with office supplies. Today, when the news cycle moves at the speed of outrage, the slow, mechanical rhythm of that old Xerox feels almost noble. Each page was a heartbeat of rebellion, each jammed tray a reminder that resistance is usually inconvenient. Ellsberg never tried to destroy the system. He tried to remind it what it was supposed to be. In the end, the Pentagon Papers weren't a story about Vietnam. They were a story about America's mirror. A country that promises liberty but flinches from the cost of honesty. A government that insists on secrets, and a citizen who dared to say, "Not this one." History moves on, but paper lasts. And somewhere in a dusty archive or a digital vault, those pages still whisper the same warning. If a democracy can't survive the truth, it's already lost the war. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave, you...